Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, another World Environment Day has just gone by, and as in the past we've heard the obligatory speeches on environmental protection, maybe with a little bit more attention this time as it came so soon after the tragedy at the Sterlite plant in Thoothukudi, and India playing host for global celebrations on the occasion. But has anything really changed over the years? The answer is yes, unfortunately for the worse. India now ranks amongst the last 5 countries in the Environmental Performance Index 2018. We've actually dropped 36 points from 141 in 2016, according to a biennial report by Yale and Columbia Universities along with the World Economic Forum. All this as we've moved 50 ranks up in the ease of doing business, almost suggesting that there is some kind of a trade-off between development and the environment. Is worsening environment the inevitable price that we have to pay for development, or is there a way out? And if yes, what is the answer? Joining me in the discussion are 2 experts, 2 stalwarts in the environment arena. Jairam Ramesh, who's worn many hats, including that of Minister, Environment and Forests under the previous government, and Srikanth Gupta, Professor, Environmental Economics and Policy, Delhi School of Economics. Welcome to the show, Jairam, Srikanth.
Right.
Jairam, let me start by asking you something that I've touched upon in my opening remarks. Is there really a trade-off between development and the environment? I know it's an old and in many ways a hackneyed debate. And the question really is that given that all development impacts environment in some way and usually adversely, where does one draw the line? And who is to decide what is the level of damage that is acceptable? And is it a function of the level of income in a country? Jairam?
The trade-off is a bogus issue, Mythili, because if growth has to be rapid, growth has to be inclusive. But if growth is not sustainable, if growth is not environmentally benign, and if it's not environmentally protective, then it's not growth at all. So I think posing it as a trade-off issue is completely wrong. A good economic growth strategy will always be environmentally protective.
Srikanth, I'm sure you will agree with Jairam, but let me ask you, the reality is that despite growing awareness of the dangers of neglecting the environment, environmental protection and development still continue to be seen as either or choices in large parts of the world. Not only in the developing world, but now increasingly we're finding even countries like US under Trump. Or do you see a change both among policymakers and civil society at large? Yes, all projects now require environmental clearance, but that clearance largely is only in form, or is it also in substance? Are we serious about it? And most important of all, do we have a mechanism to ensure proper implementation? A number of questions I know, but please take your time.
Well, 2 things to start with. First, I find myself in this unusual situation of agreeing with a politician, perhaps because he was a technocrat turned politician. The second thing is that in the year 2018, the fact that we are asking these questions, which are of course very alive, is a little bit like debating whether the earth is still flat. I think that as Jairam mentioned, that this is a false dichotomy. And the reason it's a false dichotomy, let me just give you an example. As groundwater depletes and farmers spend more money, more diesel, to pump the groundwater out, economic growth actually grows. The economy grows. Well, what we know is that we're depleting our natural capital, and depleting natural capital will only come home when the water is gone. So to think that just by spending more on pump sets and more on diesel, we are having economic growth is like thinking that, if we are a bodybuilder with steroids, it's going to be something. So basically what I'm trying to say, and I think what Jairam was also trying to say in a different way, is that this growth is not sustainable. So you can have development, but if you're going to talk about sustainable development, then I think that this current question of either or, I think has to be reframed as environment actually is development. Maintaining your natural capital and investing in your natural capital is the only way that you can get sustainable economic development, not just short-sighted, short-term economic development.
Okay, so that's a quick answer and a brief answer, and both Jairam and Srikanth are clearly in the same camp. But Jairam, the fact is that India faces environmental challenges on many fronts: air, water, land degradation, deforestation, biodiversity, coastal erosion, global warming, you name it, we have it. So which of these challenges do you think is the most pressing? And given our limited resources, can one prioritize these challenges? And if you were to prioritize them, what would your priorities be? Because at the end of the day, I know both you and Srikanth agreed that you really can't choose. But ultimately, any kind of mitigation, any kind of damage control does cost money. And we don't have pots of money. So where does one prioritize, Jairam? Is it possible at all?
No, absolutely not. I think each of them is devastating in its own way. I think you can't say that air pollution, controlling air pollution, has higher priority than dealing with water pollution. And that dealing with water pollution has higher priority than dealing with chemical contamination. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because these are essential concomitants of economic development. This is essential to the growth model that we have adopted, not only we, but the United States, China, Brazil, which is essentially grow now, pay later. You have 20 years of growth, 25 years of growth, and we'll deal with the environmental consequences of growth later. That's a false model. That's a wrong model. And I'm sure Srikanth will tell you that if you did actual accounting, if you did real green accounting, if you did green domestic product, not GDP, gross domestic product, which we all get excited about, that's what we ought to be really measuring. So I don't think we should prioritize. I think equally, air pollution, water pollution, chemical contamination, climate change, these all have public health impacts. These all have deleterious impacts on livelihoods, and they have to be addressed as part of a growth strategy that does not address pollution issues is no growth strategy. If you're going to have a growth strategy that is going to destroy forests in the name of extracting coal, I think that growth strategy should be rejected. So I think the way economists have looked at environment also is faulty. I mean, present
with exceptions are
right? There are, of course, Partha Dasgupta, Srikanth Gupta. There are many exceptions. However, the point is this: grow now, pay later. We'll worry about it later. Let's just have 20 years, 25 years of 8% growth, and then we'll worry about the consequences later. That's not right. We have to make choices now.
Okay.
And those choices have to be made because environment is extracting a public health cost.
Sure.
That's number one. Number two, there are future generations to come. So you can't deplete all your natural resources today. You have intergenerational equity issues also involved, unlike in many other countries. So I think we must open ourselves today. Increasingly, environment issue is not an environment issue. Environment is a public health issue. Let's not get into this priority business. We must have an economic growth strategy in which environment protection is embedded. If you can't protect the environment, don't adopt that growth strategy. This would be my approach.
Okay. No, you have a point, Jairam, but I sometimes wonder, because look at China. China did what Jairam said: grow now, worry later. And
clean up later.
Clean up later.
Grow now,
whatever.
clean up later.
Worry, whatever, And the fact is that today every Chinese is better off than every Indian. So can I really tell the Indian that, worry about the next generation? Because today even his own future, the very next day is not certain to him. And regardless of what Jairam says, there is a cost. Environmentally friendly growth is definitely more expensive. It's the same externality issue which we will come to a little later. So I don't know, can one really say that don't adopt a strategy which in any way spoils the environment, or can one draw a line somewhere at all? Is it possible? Because as I said, India always gets compared to China, and China is every Chinese, not just a richer Chinese, every Chinese is better off than every Indian if you look at the lower end of the pyramid.
See, good economics, and I use the word good economics, sound economics, is also good for the environment. Let me give you an example. Let's look at Delhi. Let's look at Delhi's air quality. Now, a lot of what Delhi's air quality problems are due to the way we have messed up our urban planning. We have created urban sprawl. We have unchecked growth of motor vehicles, etc. So if you had good economic policy, some of these problems would not have arisen in the first place. Now, you are presenting us with a fait accompli. Look, here's a problem. Now, where do we spend our money? I'm taking a step back and saying that even now, if we have good economic policy, good public policy, then I think some of these problems that you're mentioning would have got nipped in the bud. Now we have created this problem, and now we are faced with this Hobson's choice that, look, what are we going to do? And having said that, and having what Jairam says, all these problems are pressing, my own take, since I work a lot on climate change, is that climate change, I think, is the fundamental existential threat that humankind faces, and we in India certainly are really confronted with the climate change problem. And I think if I were to put my finger on the number one problem that we have and the one that's happening is water. Everything related to water, particularly water scarcity, water shortage, water contamination. You're seeing what's happening in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. I think that's just a small trailer of what's to come. So I think the government really should very, very seriously start worrying about water policy, water planning, the way we subsidize our water, the way we inefficiently use water, growing sugarcane in, I don't know, western UP and growing rice in Punjab and so on. And if you go back about 20, 30 years to our green revolution, we see the consequences of that coming home to roost now. Of course, you can say 20/20 hindsight, but the point still remains that we were totally oblivious of the environmental costs of the green revolution. We were totally oblivious of the sustainability of food yields coming out of the green revolution. So it's again the steroid example that you are like on steroids and you thinking I'm getting pumped up.
Except
and then it
Srikanth,
collapses.
you won't agree that the green revolution did increase yield so much, so many Indians who didn't have enough to eat got enough to eat.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely, but the sort of the underlying policies that it was sort of ineffectively, it bought us time, but as I said, you're seeing the consequences. Is that yield sustainable and at what cost is that yield coming at? So I think bad economics, bad economists, that is what leads to environmental problems, not sound economic policy, holistic thinking about economics, good urban planning. Those are the things that are missing, and I think basically I would like to say that a lot of our policy makers are knowledge proof. They really don't.
That is a dig at you.
Let me tell you.
No, well, I mean,
let me take you back to the debate on the Green Revolution. When the Green Revolution was being thought of, when it was being introduced, there were two schools of thought, whether India should go the chemical fertilizer way or whether India should go the organic fertilizer way. The Green Revolution votaries won, and thank God they won. I mean, nobody in his right mind would say that the Green Revolution was the wrong route to take back in the 60s. However, very soon, by the mid-70s, early 80s, the ecological consequences, Dr. Swaminathan himself has been saying that the Green Revolution should become the evergreen revolution. Now, that transition did not take place. So, I don't think you should say, the Green Revolution, are you against? No, nobody can be against the Green Revolution.
One can't see things in black and white, I agree entirely, particularly in economics and macroeconomics. There are different shades of grey. But whenever we talk of the environment, I think of Joan Robinson's reply to what Keynes's famous quote about in the long run we're all dead. She replied saying, but the problem is that we don't really die at the same time. So that really is the issue, particularly in the case of environment. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. So please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Jairam Ramesh and Srikanth Gupta on whether there is a trade-off really between development and the environment, and if yes, where does one draw the line? Jairam, the three main reasons why environmental challenges are really so difficult to resolve are because of what economists call externalities or market failure, the concept of public good, bad, and to some extent even the absence of property rights. For the benefit of your viewers, can you very briefly explain why do these pose such a problem when it comes to pricing? Given that environmental damage is a consequence of market failure, can you really have market solutions, and in a country like India, Jairam?
Actually, Mythili, it's a very simple issue.
Okay.
We have laws to protect the environment.
Okay.
We have regulations to protect the environment. We have institutions to enforce the laws and regulations. We don't enforce these.
Okay.
Let's not get into technicalities, externalities, market.
Okay. I'll leave that to
simple.
Okay.
It's simple.
Yeah.
We pass laws and then we take greater delight in bypassing them. So, if you look at each issue where there is an environmental disaster, Sterlite is the most recent example.
Right.
The law says you must have public hearings. What is our experience? Where there is public, there is no hearing, and where there is a hearing, there is no public.
Okay.
And government is as much to blame for this as private. Take the Ganga. Everybody says Ganga is polluted, Ganga is dirty. The stretch of the Ganga from Kannauj to Varanasi, 700 kilometers, some 650 kilometers, distilleries, tanneries, sugar mills, paper mills, all of them discharging untreated effluent into the Ganga. There are standards, there are laws, there are regulations which have not been enforced. So I think it's a culture of enforcement.
Okay.
If ease of doing business is going to take precedence over environmental considerations, if governments of the day, whichever the government, governments of the day take the view that environment is a regulatory burden, if that is your mindset, then I'm afraid we are not going to make much progress. So I think the matter is very simple, Mythili. Just enforce the laws that we have for water pollution, for air pollution, for forest conservation, for environmental protection, for the protection of coastal areas. I think the problem is administrative. The problem is political. The political if there is political direction, clear political direction, I think administrative will follow.
So can one really get away from the fact that development does cause some amount of damage, and the problem really is that you can't get civil society to understand why externalities matter, because the externality is not visible. So can we in some way get civil society to understand externalities, that there is a difference between public and private? How does one do that?
Well, see, Mythili, I'm an economist. I'm not Greenpeace. So I'm not going to argue that there should be zero pollution. I mean, that's silly, that's impractical.
Yeah.
Every time, as you said, you set up a project, you indulge in any kind of economic activity as individuals, as firms, there has to be some emissions. The question is of the optimal or the right amount. I think in our country, particularly on environmental laws, which I have been studying for a long time, Ramesh knows, we seem to have a law for every problem, and once we have a law and then there is poor enforcement, we wring our hands and say we are like this because we are like this only. I think that's a dead end. I think that there has to be a greater use of economic instruments, again as best practices in the world. Congestion pricing, green fees, green taxes, carbon taxes. There's a whole slew of economic options available in various countries of the world, ranging from South America to Europe to Asia to North America, which we somehow have given a total go by. I think we need to think of more flexibility in terms of how we comply with our environmental laws, in terms of allowing people to pay green taxes and carry on legitimate economic activities.
But people don't even pay their income tax, Srikanth. We're talking about a country like that. And look at user charges, congestion charges.
I don't agree. I think that the government now does a very good job, a much better job of tracking people.
Thanks to IT, yes. Technology has made it possible.
Presumptive ways, if you have traveled abroad, etc. So I think that, or in fact, even if I go with what you're saying, I would say yes, then the emphasis of the government should be on better enforcement of economic policies, economic instruments. I just mentioned green taxes, cap and trade, those sorts of issues, rather than saying, okay, here is the legislative danda. And the one thing that we haven't talked about, which I think we really should talk about, is judicial overreach. We have this bizarre situation in our country where the judges are making environmental policy.
Not just environmental policy, the judges are there everywhere. So that's because the executive doesn't function.
No, because there's a dysfunctionality of the bureaucracy, but also I think that this is a huge, it's a very, very serious problem. Just to think with due respect to our judiciary that a few men, largely men, are the font of all knowledge and repository of wisdom, or advised by a few other people, I think is very, very worrisome.
Jairam, you want to add something? Judicial activism is visible when there is executive vacuum.
Failure, yes.
You know, so I in fact have welcomed judicial activism. It has been a very strong dose
as a last resort
the executive was completely insensitive, and I think one of the instruments that was created in 2010 when I was minister was the National Green Tribunal, and I know many people have come to me and said that we disagree with whatever you have done, but on one thing we agree with you, which is the National Green Tribunal, because today ordinary citizens can go to the NGT.
But has it been much of a success, Jairam?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I just want to jump in here and
yeah.
say, yes, the National Green Tribunal judges are the last sort of bulwark against environmental anarchy.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing about the army.
That's true.
Why do you need to call it the army to quell civil disturbances, which means there's a fundamental problem.
Mismatch in the system.
Which you need to
needed
address.
an NGT because the executive was not really fulfilling.
But the problem, Jairam, the problem with the word activism is like good economics, bad economics. You know, what is activism that is good and what is bad? These are very subjective. So what you find is good interference, somebody else will think, no, that's not the role of the judiciary. So that's when it becomes subjective, then it always differs from person to person.
I don't think protecting forests, there can be any two opinions on the fact.
No, it's not
that forests have to be protected or rivers have to be clean. You know,
but at what
so
cost?
I don't disagree with Shrikant. I think we must make use of market instruments. Cap and trade is one example. You know, after all, in the US, acid rain was dealt with through a market instrument. And the polluter pays principle is still a very valid principle. However, the polluter pays principle should not mean the guy who can afford to pollute more ends up
pollutes more.
There's also a limit to the polluter pays principle.
Really.
But I think the point that he makes, that we have tended to depend more on administrative methods, command and control methods, and less on economic incentives. I don't disagree with that at all.
In fact, that brings me to my next question, Jairam, because you've been in public policy. So given the situation that we are in India, which one do you think, stick, carrot or stick, which works better? It has to be a mix of both.
No, it has to be both.
No, but
you can't have only carrots, you can't have only sticks.
Okay, but which one more carrot, less stick, or given if anybody who's driven on the roads of Delhi will realize that you need stick.
Carrot and stick are just two sides of the same coin. When you say a tax or a subsidy, one is a carrot and the other is a stick, but a subsidy is simply a negative tax. So I think this is an issue of semantics. But and just going back just very quickly to make one point about the NGT and the judiciary, yes, they have been our only source of succor in this sort of situation. But I think the point is that the very credibility of these institutions is being tested, and the Kaveri and so on, because what if tomorrow people say we don't even care for sort of the last resort. And just very quickly, I just wanted to say that because you started off with this point, why is it that now this has become this jobs versus environment? I think it has become this because of the faulty way in which we're thinking of growth. And I think that this making a growth fetish, or at least framing the debate in that way of jobs versus environment, which we started saying was a false dichotomy, has become so salient in people's mind that the moment you start talking about forests or water, they think you're anti-development, anti-growth. And I think as an economist who works on environment, I think nothing could be further from the truth. And I say this from a very reasoned perspective, not from a knee-jerk, pardon using the metaphor of Greenpeace, it's not from that perspective.
Yeah, sure. You certainly have a point, Shrikant, which brings me, Jairam, to my last question. And this is on the issue of division of responsibilities. Isn't part of the problem the fact that, though the Constitution says that protection of the environment is a state's responsibility, there's a little bit of fuzziness when you come to, what is the union's responsibility. And I always prefer the word union to center, because the center has a very different connotation. What is the union's responsibility? What's the state government's responsibility? And ultimately, to my mind, many of these issues actually should be the responsibility of the third tier, the panchayat, because it is the people who are immediately affected, who have the maximum to lose or to gain. So is this fuzziness in some way causing, it's nobody's baby?
No, I think, well, it's certainly a symptom of the problem that many of our laws are federal in nature, are union union laws made by the central union government, and they are enforced by the state. And in fact, many of the environmental protests are neither at the union level or at the state level, but they are at the local level.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So, but yeah, I mean that's a symptom of a problem, but I wouldn't say that that's the overriding problem that we are facing. If the problem we are facing is what Shrikant says, that our conception of growth, the very architecture of growth, does not internalize environmental concerns, does not give primacy to environmental concerns. If a project or if an investment has an adverse effect on the environment, if it can be rectified, how can it be rectified? If it cannot be rectified, can an alternative investment be
and if there is a cost, who bears the cost? I think that is also very
sometimes an investment is inevitable, right? You have to do it, but given the inevitability of what you have to do, what's the best way of minimizing the environmental damage? But there may be cases where you will be called upon to say that no, I don't want this investment because the environmental damage is so irretrievable that there is no point doing it. And I would certainly put, if there is an investment that destroys large areas of natural forest, that is an irretrievable damage. This is non-negotiable. However, if there are investments which lead to air pollution, water pollution, there are technologies, to rectify, to deal with it. So it's a case by case approach.
Absolutely, but I'm afraid we run out of time completely. So I'll have to end this discussion now. This really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Jairam and Srikanth, for joining me in the discussion and telling our viewers about the need to really internalize environmental questions whenever we think of growth, something that we still really need to do in this country. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition with Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.